So when you reach the same,
No, on Friday I'm talking about recovery and resilience. So it's the paper that I developed with code, and this is for the special issue. This is the introduction. I don't have to pay.
Okay,
So it's more
the one day.
right.
Okay.
Yeah, this one is more.
But it's from the same special issue.
It's from the special.
So you'll need to switch brains.
I know today.
Yeah, sure. It's gonna be too complicated.
Yes, I know, because it's.
Okay, and so I try to look at reports that I'm not the big.
Check out. Maybe it's a bit late.
Yes.
Presentation.
Yes, we need to see. Yes.
Do you want to try the pointer?
It's okay.
So,
Yeah, I don't think I will prepare today for the presentation. This one, yeah?
Yes.
Yes.
And presentation. So just a quick video. Yes. So it should be only one time.
Yeah.
Thank you. And then I'll give it to them.
Thank you so much for coming to our seminar today. My name is Federica Genovese. I'm a fellow here, a member of the European Study Center, and it's a delight to have today's intervention, the two-big paper by Stella Ladi, also here, with co-author for Copeland, who is on Zoom. We are delighted to have Stella, who is visiting actually here. So like you can see her around. It's not a one-off sort of meeting that we're having today. She's a professor of public policy at DPIR University in London. She's also an associate professor at Panteion University in Athens. She works on various issues related to public policy. So she has expertise on global public policy, but she has also worked for a few years, in fact, on public policy and politics in the context of the EU. She has interesting research on the Recovery and Resilience Fund, bailout politics, and public administration sort of politics. So Copeland is a professor of public policy also at the Queen Mary University in London. He is an expert of EU politics and policy making, specifically the single market, but he's also worked on the UK role in the EU. So he's worked on Brexit and the Euroscepticism as well. We have the pleasure to have a discussant who is Georgios Kostakos. His CV is super long, so I'll just extract a couple of points. So he's the executive director of the Foundation for Global Governance and Solidarity. He has worked for the UN. He served as the assistant secretary of UNGA, and he's also worked in various consortia around Europe, and with a lot of international relevance, in recent years. I guess Stella has slides. She will go for about 20 minutes to present her work, which is entitled Reconceptualizing the EU-member states' relationship in the age of permanent emergency. And then Georgios can take 10 minutes to discuss, and then we open the floor.
So yes, Thank you very much, Federica. I'm very pleased to meet you in person. And thank you for having me here today. Just a clarification. The paper is written with Laura Polverari from the University of Padua.
Right. Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, and Discussants, sorry.
That we are actually co-editing this special issue. This is all coming out very soon in the comparative European politics. With Paul, we do have a paper together in the special issue that we're presenting on Friday at the Department of Politics on the Recovery and Resilience facility. So Paul will act as a discussant today on the European aspects of the paper together with Georgios.
Sorry.
It's confusing. There are too many people in this panel, but also was keen to create a panel rather than just a presentation. So I will start straight away and by saying that this is conceptual paper that we've written in order to frame the changes that we saw happening during, especially the COVID crisis, in the way the EU tackled this specific crisis. And then this paper was presented for various other authors to write specific, more specific cases with more detailed case studies that will all appear as a special issue. I will use both. Thank you. So the main argument that we are putting forward here is that since 2008, we have been having a succession of crises globally, but also in Europe. We're using the term perma-crisis more than the term polycrisis, although polycrisis has been very often used in the literature. We are selecting the perma-crisis in the sense that the one that we are in a kind of an era, let's say, of continuous mode of crisis policymaking. Even if some of these events could be seen as normal events and are expected, we are dealing with them as a crisis. So I think the perma-crisis term is somehow a little bit more helpful in describing how the policymakers are feeling that they are dealing with these problems and how the public is also feeling. So this perma-crisis is affecting the EU polity, and I'm using the term polity here to say the institutions, but also the politics of the EU. They are creating institutional responses in different policy areas, but they are also reaffirming the centrality of the member states. So nothing could have happened in response to COVID or in response to the Ukrainian crisis if the member states were not in the center and supporting it. The member states were always there, but I think we have spent quite a lot of time in European studies talking about the institutions, integration, where we are going as a union. But what we saw in the crisis is that, yes, the institutions are important, but the member states were equally important, and somehow the relationship is starting being rethought. So we are saying here that a new mode of Europeanization made its appearance during the COVID-19 crisis. There has been a lot of discussion on the Europeanization literature. Probably you are familiar with it as a circular process where the EU is affecting the member states, but also the member states, the EU, and how this is changing the policies at the national and EU level. What we're saying here is that because of all this pressure, we've seen the development of a new mode, which we call coordinated Europeanization, which is a process where we have increased and often informal coordination between the member states and the EU institutions, which take place during the early stages of the crisis, so much faster than we would expect, in view of quickly devising policy solutions that work for everyone, in the sense that if the solutions are not implemented, there is not much point in them. So thereby, the decision-making speed for the reform has been enhanced through this mode of Europeanization. Another aspect which is very important is that reform ownership, and this is where we see this different relationship with the member states, is becoming very, very important, exactly policy compliance and implementation to be possible. So it's not only reforms that are thought at the EU level, but they are reforms that have to be owned by the member states. And the Recovery and Resilience Facility is a very good example of that. The way the national programs were developed was very much about ownership, in contrast to what we had seen during the Eurozone and the bailouts, where ownership was much more limited. So this does not mean that pre-existing modes of Europeanization do not exist anymore. So we have soft Europeanization tools being used. We have coercive Europeanization tools used. So it's not that we are only coordinating and that we are all a happy family. Previous mechanisms are still there. De-Europeanization trends may still exist at the same time as coordinated Europeanization, especially if some member states feel that some of the new policies, the changes that are happening are going too far. And especially if we think that there is no treaty reform taking place at the same time, yeah? There is no question of a treaty reform, since this is something that there wouldn't be an easy consensus. So a lot of these changes are kind of underground or informal, but still very formal. So this could push some member states feeling that they don't belong. Up to now, there is a balance in that. We haven't seen anything like that happening after Brexit. There is a balance in that, and countries, even Hungary, are pushed to cooperate even when they disagree, for example, with the Ukrainian aid. And of course, the agenda for the future is still to explore whether coordinated Europeanization applies only to acute phases of crisis, or if it is a mode that is kind of starting being used more in the EU, even in areas where when there isn't a crisis, or what are we keeping from it? Maybe we won't keep everything, but maybe some elements of it are here. So the agenda of the special issue and of the research that is happening on this field is going beyond the discussion of more or less European integration. So we are not interested in whether the EU is going to integrate more or less, but more on what is happening with the public policy agenda of the EU and how the EU is managing or not managing to adequately respond to global crisis using the existing or new means. So we are very much interested in the policy domains and how they react, and not so much on what this will mean for the future of the EU. Of course, the research that is taking place here can inform the other discussion, and we build on work that other scholars have done, but we're not working with the integration theories here. Another point here is the crisis of the last 15 years are mainly exogenous, and this is important to keep in mind when we're talking about how the EU has responded. So, for example, the Eurozone crisis, COVID-19, the war on Ukraine, this does not mean that the EU didn't play a role or didn't have influenced badly or positively the development of this crisis, but they were mainly events that happened because of bigger global crises, such as the financial crisis, such as the pandemic, which was global, or a regional but very also global conflict, that we see with Ukraine. And these crises often lead to internal crises, endogenous crises, such as Brexit, immigration waves, Euroscepticism. So I think it's good to, because many times also in the literature we talk about both like they're one, but I think it's good to distinguish. So here the key questions is, in which policy areas is coordinated Europeanization taking place? Do we see this coordination in all areas, or are some areas more prone to this coordination? Is coordinated Europeanization always linked to crisis and or emergency? And what kind of policy and governance solutions emerge out of it, and how successful and long-lasting are they? So these questions are not answered, of course, all in our paper. Some of them are answered in the special issue, and some of them are there for future research. Yes. So what we are saying here is that coordinated reorganization has led to changes both at the EU level and at the domestic levels. These changes can range from incremental to radical. At the EU level, what we've seen is that the European Commission plays a very central role in pushing forward quite ambitious policy solutions that many times already existed in the drawers. They were already there as ideas, but they were not. They didn't have the opportunity to push them forward. And the Commission is playing an important role in achieving compromises faster and bringing key decisions forward to ensure effective implementation. I know this sounds very positive, but indeed it happened. It happened with the vaccine strategy. We have discussed it a lot with your colleague here. It has happened with the RRF. I'm not saying here that the member states were not important, but I'm saying that the Commission was setting the stage and was there to facilitate this coordination, although it is a heavy bureaucracy with all the problems that we know. At the national level, national actors in this mode of reaction should in principle find it easier to implement the EU decisions, since a lot of since the viability and the potential for quick implementation were checked in advance. So there were a lot of meetings during COVID, for example, online with the capitals, and not just with the people that would normally be involved in the negotiations, so with the permanent representations or with the specific ministries that we would normally see, but with whoever would be key for implementing. So there was much more, also because of the online and the facility of bringing more people from the capitals in the discussion, there was a lot of checking whether these things would be viable. And here, yes, I'm giving various examples, so we can go into details and examples later where we've seen that happening, the COVID-19 crisis and the Recovery and Resilience Facility, even the borders control, the Green Pass, although at the beginning countries were closing the borders, quickly we had the developed quickly. People would say, no, it was not quick enough, but it was a few months, yeah, that we had the Green Pass, and at least within Europe, first with the corridors for the personnel and the materials that were related to the medical aspects of the crisis, but then later for everybody, there was a possibility for moving. The vaccination strategy that I'm now working on a paper on it, which, yes, internally is a very big success. Of course, externally, there are discussions about what this meant for the global level. So this is the next discussion to see what this coordination may mean for the global level sometimes. And this. So, did I? No. Here. So what are the main features, just to start summarizing? The rationale here of this coordinated Europeanization has been joining forces to solve transboundary problems. So there is a new interdependence feeling in this crisis. This perception of a positive sum game, even if in face of redistributional costs, not all member states are participating in the same way in the budget and in the tackling of this crisis, but there was this positive sum game feeling. The timing was in response to an emergency of a major existential crisis, meant that it was much more fast-paced to reach agreement and fast implementation. This is not the case with other type of crises, which are what we call them slow burning, like climate. Even with technology, although we do have an AI Act much quicker than many other countries, here it's slower. When the feeling is that there is an emergency and there is an existential crisis, and existential also for the EU as a unity. I think this was what really pushed them, at least during the RRF, to have an agreement. This brings this pace, which is faster. The key actors, as I said, was the European Commission, but also the member states, but with their core executives. Regions and other actors are not so much involved here because of the fast pace. And of course, the European Council, more than the Council of Ministers, taking key decisions about the strategy. The Parliament is not so involved in these first stages, although a lot of it has to be ratified at the later stage. Left out actors, I was already mentioning them, the subnational actors, private actors, depending. Sometimes they're in, sometimes they're out. So with the RRF, they were in pretty soon because in order to be sure that the national plans are implemented, the governments had to make sure that the big companies could actually implement very quickly. Civil society organization less in, and the European Parliament, as I said, it's not so involved. What is interesting is that the type of change is mainly radical during this crisis. So things that were there discussed for ages are happening much quicker. Procurement, common procurement, bonds, Eurobonds in reality, defense collaboration. So pretty radical solutions for what we would normally expect. The modality, it's informal exchanges, a lot of informal exchanges, which of course the criticism there would be that this is not very democratic, that it's not, the checks and balances may not always work, but it is efficient, often online, and a lot of work prior to the formal proposals. The output is fast agreement on course of action, crisis management policies with national ownership, and quick implementation, but possible drawbacks for subnational authorities and private civil society actors. Outcome and effectiveness, of course, there we don't know so much. We know that some short-term effects are visible, and we have a quick activation in policy responses, and people are reacting well to it. So the Eurobarometer shows that people were trusting the EU for the COVID response in the first instance, at least after they forget about it. The RRF did help to have at least to have a stability in the economy, but we don't know long-term what will happen. This we will need to see, of course, in research a little bit later. A few words about coordinated Europeanization and de-Europeanization. As I was saying, this perma crisis have boosted the feeling of the interdependence between EU member states and the appetite for coordinated solutions. Lead to the awareness that national governments alone could not tackle a transboundary crisis, especially COVID. I think was a very clear case where boundaries and borders did not mean anything. And also the awareness that the austerity paradigm that was used during the Eurozone crisis or regulating, which is what we're doing, for example, for climate, is not enough. And alone, it cannot really work. Even Europe-skeptic countries like Hungary, as I was saying, were keen to compromise at some point because of the RRF money very often. Yeah, there is a stick and carrot there. However, this shift towards coordinated Europeanization cannot be taken for granted, and it may coexist with these tendencies towards de-Europeanization or differentiated integration. Sometimes we may see that national governments, that maybe their executives were very keen to negotiate and to agree these solutions that they are quite radical sometimes, may not be able at the end to implement the decisions or drag the whole country with them. So some stakeholders may be left out and may feel that they want to change the course of events. And of course, cleavages between member states still exist. So it's not although we are saying that the relationship between the member states and the institutions is being rethought, this does not mean that the national interests are really changing and the relationship between member states themselves is totally changing. This remains the same. The only thing that may help is this feeling of interdependence in light of the type of the crisis, which is much more transboundary. And to conclude and open it to discussion, so we're saying here that we live in this era of perma-crisis, which is challenging for all parts of the world in different ways. The EU has managed to respond quite successfully for its own causes. I'm not saying as a global actor, but for its own causes in the last few crises. And here I'm taking you a little bit to where I want to go with the project that I'm designing right now. Could coordinated Europeanization extend beyond emergency policy making? And should it be institutionalized? Or would this mean that it's becoming also, it loses this edginess that it has now? But even more interesting for me would be to go to a more global agenda and to see what we can learn about multilateralism more generally. So could we find instances where multilateralism has worked? And if yes, under what conditions? Can the conditions that we are discovering in the EU exist at the global level? What lessons can we learn from the EU for the global level, but also from other cases that we could select? And under what conditions does multilateralism work when facing global challenges that are more slow burning, such as the climate crisis or the technological advancements? Are we in a different, totally framework there? Does any of this can help? Or are we talking about a situation which is not even crisis related in reality? And I will leave it here.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much. All right, and 20 minutes, so perfect, look at you. Okay, I would say maybe Georgios starts and then he'll give the words to Paul, if that's okay.
Yes, if you want to bring the global now more. Into
Oh,
it's up to you, really. Up to you.
What do you think?
Imagine that. Paul might make
Well,
more, define a bit more the.
Okay, so maybe Paul, if
And she
he's
knows the
okay.
project quite well. So.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks. Roughly how long do I have? Maybe 10 minutes, say, or?
10 minutes, I was gonna think, yeah.
Okay, cool. So yeah, thanks for accommodating my train strike preferences. It would have been nice to come along and discuss this in person. So yeah, I've been involved in this project with Stella as a co-author on one of the papers, but also sort of witnessed firsthand its sort of evolution and development. And what I sort of like about this concept or idea of coordinative conditionality, and particularly how it's framed in the special issue, is that this is sort of the beginning of a research agenda rather than an end point. Because I think when I read through the material again, I was sort of struck by how many more questions there are to answer, and how this really does sort of represent the beginning of a process or potential evolution in EU governance. And just to give a sort of flavor of that, when the paper that Stella and I wrote with our colleague Dimitri, we had 3 case studies, and we were looking at the negotiations of the Recovery and Resilience Facility. And those 3 case studies were Slovakia, Greece, and Austria. And we were particularly interested in the sort of initially the power dynamics between three member states of similar size in the Eurozone, but have quite different relationships with the process of European integration. And one of the fascinating things, I think, for us was that there was much more of a collaborative, non-hierarchical spirit in those negotiations. Sure, there were some differences in tendencies. Austria, for example, the scale of the funds there was much smaller, and seemed to be much more bullish about what it wanted to do. But in Slovakia, for example, the feeling there with the people that we interviewed was also one in which people felt like they had the support that they needed from the Commission, and they really were in control of where these funds were being spent and what was being done. But I think the really interesting thing there, and sort of unpacking the paper further, is that in October 2023, there was a change of government in Slovakia. And so one of the interesting things about this coordinative conditionality, or coordinative Europeanization, sorry, is that how does it intersect with politics? What happens when you agree something at EU level, but then governments shift and change? And what is then the response to that, and what does that mean for these programs overall? And I do sort of wonder, on the other hand, with coordinative Europeanization, is that particular relationship with politics or politicization. It's not something that's within the scope of the special issue, or the work that's already been done on it. But there is a bit of a tension here between increased politicization in the EU, the need for the EU to be seen to be doing something and acting and coordinating. Meanwhile, the heightened sense of crisis sometimes reduces the space for debate and deliberation with endpoints, and I find that a really fascinating sort of tension within this coordinated Europeanization, is how politics matters when it matters and what happens when that politics changes. And I think that's definitely a future research agenda there. I think the second thing, and it's the question you sort of had on your slide, Stella, was about the relationship between crisis and the everyday governance, and the extent to which coordinative Europeanization becomes much more everyday. You know, we have these crises that come along and they create particular sets of conditions. And I was sort of wondering, was mindful of something I read a couple of months ago, I think, around this idea of cash for reforms in cohesion policy. You know, so when it comes to the EU's cohesion funds, is it likely that a similar model to the one that you outline in the special issue, is it likely that that is also going to come to fruition in the everyday governance space? And again, I think there's another tension there between member states as veto players, as it were, in agreeing that and going forward, and the need for the EU to act. I think that's often one of the interesting things about a crisis, is that the pressure, tension, and uncertainty there might make governments behave differently to agreeing these kind of things than the everyday, when there's less of a pressure to actually do something. And I'm just sort of thinking back, maybe showing my age a bit here, to some of the very early literature on the employment strategy, and how when the OMC and the soft law governance came to fruition, there was always a debate in the background in commission circles about whether tying soft law to you know, some kind of cash for reforms issue around the cohesion funds. And so, yeah, I'd be really interested to see how that sort of plays out in the future. And I think one of the unspoken aspects, and this will just be my final point, is, or maybe I've got 2 points actually, is again in your slides, we talk about this idea of sort of like the austerity paradigm and regulation is now perceived as maybe not being enough for European integration. And I agree with you. I really do. I think we may have reached the limits of that model of integration. But I wonder where the money comes from. And so I think there's some really interesting avenues and explorations around that. But it would seem that what the special issue reveals is really the centrality and importance of hard cash, and the difference that makes, particularly at the EU level. And I don't know what the answer to that is. And I'm glad I don't have to come up with it, to be honest, because I think it's a difficult circle to square. But I think it's definitely, as somebody who studied soft law for maybe too long, I can honestly say that the elephant in the room there is what changes when there's cash on the table. You know, and I think things often do, and so forth. And then I think that then links in nicely maybe to a final point, which again fits into this a possible future research agenda, is really the effectiveness of all of this. Because what we do, and I think you know this yourself, Stella, and that was never the aim of the special issue, but it's like, do we really see tangible differences in the effectiveness of this? And I want to be optimistic and say yes, like I really hope so. But I guess we just don't know. But I guess the good thing is within the literature, we have, dare I say, hundreds of examples of Europeanization without hard cash. And so now what we can see is the difference that may make and the effectiveness of this governance tool. So when I read this special issue and all the questions that sort of come to mind, I don't think there's one research agenda here. I think you maybe have several that you can sort of tap into, because there are some really fascinating questions that come up. And, for that reason, I thoroughly enjoyed reflecting on it and also being part of it. So thank you.
Should we propose that for Stella to sort of react on these comments before so that it becomes more interactive, maybe? You can choose whether some you want to take after this, or...
I'm not gonna say much like, because these are discussions that we are having with Paul and the other authors, but maybe it's a good opportunity to say a few more things from the special issue. The one about politicization is a big question. And I think what we saw during the crisis were instances of depoliticization in reality, because politics were not so important at this particular moment where a solution was needed, because if not, citizens would be dying, or we would be having very imminent problems. So I think yes, when things go back to normal and politics come in, we have to rethink. But at the same time, I think all this agenda about politicization has been again overplayed, like the integration theories agenda. I think we have to move on a bit. Why to talk about politicization and not just talk simply about how politics change or do not change policies? This is democratic. This is what should happen. When there is no crisis, if we change our mind, we should change policies. It's not a matter of just politicizing. It's a matter of letting politics do what they should do. Crisis and everyday governance. For cohesion policy, since Paul mentioned, it's a good moment to advertise another paper in the special issue that Laura Polverari, which is exactly about this issue, how the RRF and the recovery and the resilience facility mechanisms are competing with cohesion policy, and whether cohesion policy will start integrating some of the tools. It seems like it does. So there we are already seeing some institutionalization of what happened during the recovery and resilience facility moment. The difference on funding, I totally agree. And here we saw the difference that Eurobonds made in comparison to loans that had to do also only with austerity policies. I'm not saying that turning EU to a continent that has a huge debt will solve the problem. We cannot do that. Growth has to follow in order to be able to repay the debts, because if not, it's not viable. So obviously, this is not just the solution, but at least it shows that we have to be more open to a variety of tools, and not to just eliminate some just because of ideological reasons, as we saw during the Eurozone crisis. And the effectiveness of all this, I would say that we already see effectiveness, because we haven't seen, I think, what we were facing when COVID started, and a bit later with Ukraine, would have been already a dismantling of the EU. So we didn't see that. Of course, you can never do research. It's not research. It's not. You don't know what would have happened. But I think it's quite safe to say that if we had not had the response of the RRF, of the vaccine strategy, of the collaboration that we had for Ukraine, as a continent, as a union, we would have been much weaker. I cannot measure it, I cannot say how much, but I think it's already more effective than it would have been if not. Now, whether this will last, future will show. That's it, I stop.
We can pick up on some of this in the broader discussion, but maybe now we go with Georgios.
Yeah, let me from a global perspective. I recognize things that I've seen at the UN happening over time since its creation after the Second World War. So, for example, when we had the Suez Canal crisis in the mid-50s, so peacekeeping was invented, something that was not in the UN Charter, be able to deal with it. And you had the good coincidence of a proactive Secretary General, Dag Hammarskjöld, Lester Pearson is the Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, the Prime Minister of Canada. So there were some countries that were more interested in doing that. Of course, the context is different. Now it's 193 countries compared to 27. But even at the time, it was close to 100 countries, if I remember correctly, during that period. The colonization was still ongoing. But yeah, still a lot more. And that is comprehensive in a way. It does not have external borders like the EU has. And the EU, perhaps it's an integration to federation project, while the UN is not exactly the same. So all these things considered, still, I can tell you moments in the UN's history where crises were actually the drivers, or at least the excuses for people and institutions to reposition themselves vis-a-vis other institutions within the same framework of the UN system, or even towards the outside, other actors. So one of them was peacekeeping, which is a big thing, doesn't exist in the charter. It was never included in the charter because it's so difficult to change it. Perhaps it's easier to change the treaties of the EU, maybe. A bit more than one, at least since. But yeah. So another thing is the Secretary General over time has built a moral capital and authority that is more than one would have expected by just reading the charter, by building on Article 99, which says the Secretary General is the other articles say he is the chief operating officer of the organization, the CEO, but at the same time, Article 99 gives him, says him, here eventually, the opportunity to bring a topic to the attention of the Security Council, where you have only 15 members and 5 are permanent big powers, whatever. The Secretary General, a human being, head of the Secretariat, can bring to their attention something that he thinks that might impact negatively international peace and security. And that its use, or even the threat of its use, has created a political role for the Secretary General. Can come in front of the big powers and say, this is going to, let's say, upset the world balances and all that. So that's another thing that over time has been used quite a bit. We're losing it when we don't have a very practical Secretary General. But yeah, also questions about continuity and institutionalization of some of these responses. Also, for the veto of the permanent members, for example, something that there is a problem also in the EU, the veto of the countries for certain issues. There are ways of going around it. Again, in the 50s, when we had the North Korean invasion of the South, we had the Uniting for Peace resolution passed, which said, because of the Soviet veto in the Security Council, that you can go around it and go to the General Assembly and ask it to respond if the Security Council could not respond. And it's been used still now for Ukraine, for Israel, whenever there is a veto. So that's also there. And a very personal experience is about climate change. When we have a separate agency dealing with that, UNFCCC, in 2007, when Ban Ki-moon became Secretary General, I was in the small team that we proposed, and he accepted to bring it to the heads of state and government level. Up to then, it was more environment ministries and a bit foreign ministries, but to make it also a political issue because it is a crisis. I mean, it's a crisis with many dimensions and impacting on many aspects of life and economy and everything. So we had the first high-level event on climate change in September 2007, and we had about 80 presidents and prime ministers who came to New York for that. And they showed that they don't leave it up to the ministers anymore and came to this level, as we said, for crisis to be dealt at the highest level. Yeah. So, I mean, I can give you many more examples. So there is perhaps some cross-fertilization there you can get. And for me, some questions now from what I heard, and they are valid in the UN context too, what depends on the crisis and the crisis response. Sometimes politicians want to show that they're responding to something and do something, but it's not necessarily the best. They don't allow others to propose things because they have to grab the microphone and offer a solution. And it's not always the best solution, perhaps. So, yeah, that's something to keep in mind. Is it an efficient and effective response, or it's a spasmodic, I don't know, is that the English word, and which may turn out to be costly in the long term, right? Then the national leaders, indeed, it comes to their level, and then they leave out municipalities, parliamentarians, others. So the executive grabs more power through that. And that, again, it's not necessarily good, depends. It can be efficient, but it can be also more prone to corruption. For example, we see what happened with vaccination and the price Europe paid for the Pfizer vaccines, right? I mean, yeah, there was no discussion. We need it now. Give as much as they asking for, and that for the money could be dealt many issues at a lower level of expense. In addition to increasing the own resources of the EU, there has to be more taxation on the rich, probably, right? More these things that we pay now. The arms industry gets as much as they want because of the needs of the Ukraine defense. And so all of this has to be kept in mind for a properly functioning democratic polity. And a couple more things. Yeah, all this is also when the elephants fight, the grass pays for it. When the elephants make love, also the grass pays for it. And even in this case, when the big leaders of the EU come together to find solutions, what about the neighborhood in Africa and others? Because they can pay the high price for the vaccine, right? They can pay for armaments, but the rest of the world loses. And that can create from migration ways, right, to other resentment and a sense of spoiler attitudes, because they try to solve everything to suit them and their elections and their citizens and not the rest. And the EU is becoming something like the US, where like isolationist, because the complexity of its own institutional arrangements absorb a lot of energy, and they don't allow it to see also the bigger world often, which it impacts them. It's impacted by it. Yeah, so there can be a backlash. So finally, a proposal that we've been making, my foundation folks for global governance sustainability and others also more and more is we have the Security Council. Should we have a more institutionalized body for crisis response and preparation for crisis also in terms of resilience and a global resilience council for the world, or a systemic crisis response council, now we may rename it. What about the European Union also, so that it can be more known in advance how it's going to react? It cannot always be at prime minister or president level, perhaps, but it has to be close to their office and something that is more predictable and regular, although the crises are irregular, but they're permanent and they are poly and multidimensional. So we have to do something more long term to them.
A lot on the table.
I know, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
You're welcome to, if you want to pick on a couple of those, otherwise, I mean,
Just picking his brain for now for the next program. But I think we more or less said the same. So let's open it.
okay, yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Okay.
Maybe my name is Genovese. I'm from the European Commission, so I'm the one who was in the crisis. He also said that cash cow, let's say itself. I'm